Blog Talk Radio.
I did the introduction, and at first I want to wish you a good evening and welcome to the show.
Yeah, glad to be here.
Now, I know that you have presidentialufo.com, but I believe you've got a couple other websites. Can you run through and plug all that you're doing right now?
Yeah, I have the Hillary Clinton UFO.net, and I have the Barack Obama UFO.com site.
Okay. And those are all, three of those are your sites?
Yes.
Okay. Now, what we usually do in these programs is I do a combination between a set of questions, and also I do I take questions off the SHTF411.com mini chat from our forum members.
Yep.
Right now, my computer's still a little frozen up. It's an older operating system. It's a new program, and but can you start us off with what got you interested in UFOs?
Okay.
As far as
right now?
Yes, please. It's an interesting story.
Okay. The way I got involved was there was a series of sightings occurring. I live just about 65 miles north of the Canadian-U.S. border, and about 1975, beginning of the year, there was a number of sightings in a town called Carmen, which is about 35 miles southwest of where I live in the big city. And this went on for weeks and months, and there was reports and stuff. And eventually I got my friends to, let's go out and see what this thing was about. I really wasn't interested in UFOs. And I went out there, and an hour after we got there, we didn't know what everybody was looking at, I saw the thing, and it literally changed my life. It flew right in front of the car. I went out 2 nights later. It came right at us the second night. And basically I started to investigate the people, because half the town of 2,000 people had seen this thing. So I started to investigate at that point and talk to people as to what they'd seen, and went from there to studying what the Canadian government knew, to what the former president of Penn State University knew, and that led me through his files to the presidents of the United States.
Wow. So prior to this, did you have an interest in UFOs or extra?
Nothing whatsoever. No, absolutely can't remember ever thinking about it. I had an interest in life after death and stuff like that. I had done some research when I was at university on that. But in terms of UFOs, no, absolutely no interest. It was just this thing was reported time after time in the newspaper, and then the local one of the local TV networks went out there and actually caught this thing jumping off the ground. They filmed this thing jumping off the ground, and at that point, this was in May of 1975. I said to my friends, I said, "Come on, let's go and see what this is all about. I mean, I want to see what all this fuss is about." And it was like winning, had like the lottery ticket. You figure when you go out there, it's not going to be there, nothing will happen. And we were actually there for an hour and looking around, couldn't find anything. And we're driving out of town, and my friend said, "Well, we'll drive back into town one more time, and if we don't see anything, we'll go home." And if we hadn't seen anything, that going back in, I never would have gotten involved, because I really didn't have any interest. I just wanted to see what everybody else was looking at.
Wow. That's
so some people have sightings, and it's sort of like the guy who was driving the car. There was 3 of us. The guy who was in the back seat, I haven't seen him for 35 years. I don't know what happened to him, but the guy who was driving, I have breakfast with him every Sunday, and you can talk to him, and he'll say, "Yeah, whatever Grant saw, yeah, that's what we saw, yeah, it's all true," but he will never talk to about it. I have breakfast with him every Sunday. We never talk about UFOs, and yet he was involved in a number of my first sightings, and it really didn't affect his life as he went back and went to work and got married and did all the regular things. Really didn't get into it, and with me, it was sort of like a switch went off. It was like I was at the university at the time, and I said, I was having a hard time at the university trying to figure out, like, why am I doing this? I figured it was like a waste of time. And then when I saw this, I said, "Man, this is what I got to do." This was interesting. This was just I just sort of became totally fascinated with the subject, and pulled out in about 1990, after we published a book on the former president of Penn State University. We sort of thought we'd broken the cover up, and none of the press would pick up on it. And I sort of dropped out there for a few years, and then when I got back into with the presidents, I got back in even worse than before, and now I'm retired now, and basically that's basically all I do.
Now, how did you I'm going to have to use the word stumble. How did you stumble on to investigating the presidential role in this?
Well, what happened was I interviewed all these people in Carmen, Manitoba, and I published a manuscript. I put a manuscript together, I sent it to a bunch of publishers, and they looked at it, and some of them were interested, and some of them gave it a reading at their editorial board or whatever. Never really got published. I remember the last one that I went to was a big local publisher, and I live in a city of about 700,000 people, the big local publisher here, and I remember her writing back the rejection letter and said to me, you may believe in this kind of stuff, count me among the unbelievers. And that was my rejection letter. And at that point, I've never really studied sightings since. I have no interest in UFO sightings. To me, it's a total waste of time. I can tell you about my sightings. I had some pretty dramatic sightings, and it's all very interesting. You'll listen to it, and you'll say, oh, that's very interesting. But it really doesn't prove anything. To me, when I saw it, and once I became disillusioned with sightings, that, this book of sightings of something went on for about a year and a half, and all this stuff, that nobody really wanted to publish it, or I decided I had to get some proof to show what I had seen. That was all I was interested in. I saw this thing. It was my father's a pilot, my son's a pilot. I'm not stupid. I know this was nothing that we have, and so I was interested in getting the answer. And one of the people who was involved in the Carmen sightings was a guy who was a radar tech who had worked for Wilbert Smith, who was the head of the Canadian government program from 1950 to 1954, and he was a radar tech who was working at a flying saucer station that the Canadian government had built, Wilbur Smith had built, where they were trying to detect flying saucers at the nation's capital. And he told me the story about how he was there when all the bells and whistles went off in this thing, and he was changing the tapes. He was just a junior radar technician and engineer there. And he told me, he said, well, you should study Wilbur Smith, because, if you want to know what's going on with UFOs, he was talking to the aliens and they were landing in his backyard. And I went, they were what? So I investigated this story. By that time, Wilbur Smith was dead. I went and talked to his wife. I talked to a bunch of associates who had worked with him, and the story was actually very true. The Canadian government had done this investigation, and Wilbur Smith was quite convinced that he was in contact with these aliens. And he wrote a famous document that has been released. It's called the Top Secret Memo, and this is the document where he describes the fact that it's the flying saucers is the most highly classified subject in the United States. This is based on his communication with officials in the United States at the Canadian Embassy in Washington. Flying saucers is the most highly classified secret in the United States, and the modus operandi is unknown, but there's a small group headed by Vannevar Bush who's trying to figure it out. And then he also said that mental phenomena was involved, and that if the Americans have told us mental phenomena is involved with flying saucers, and if we have anything, the Americans are willing to exchange material. So I investigated that, and that investigation led to a guy who was giving the material at the Canadian Embassy, who was a military scientist from Washington, D.C. by the name of Dr. Robert Sarbacher. And, of course, we wanted to know, well, where did he get this material about the fact that flying saucers were for real, and it was the most highly classified secret. And he said, well, there was a briefing that had occurred around 1950 at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and he was one of the scientists that was invited to the briefings to be told what they had discovered from the bodies in the craft and all this sort of stuff. And he was not able to go. And Stanton Friedman, the famous ufologist, had done an interview with him in 1983, and he was asking Sarbacher, he was saying, well, who was involved in this? Who are the people that went? I mean, you didn't go. And he was naming off von Braun and von Neumann and Bush and all these different people. And Friedman said, well, is there anybody that's still alive? And he said, well, there's this guy in Pennsylvania, and he was a real arrogant guy. He thought he knew everything. He went to all the meetings. He would know. And when the research was done, we tracked it down to Dr. Eric Walker, who was the former president of Penn State University, who was good friends with